Part 1, The Breaking Point. It was the morning of my birthday when I saw the post. Corin Duan, my husband, had shared a picture of himself and his female secretary, Christine, both wearing matching rings. The caption was casual, but the implications were loud and clear. Work partners are also life partners. My heart dropped. I stared at the image for what felt like an eternity, each second stretching, twisting the knife deeper into my gut. The picture was perfect, Corin's arm wrapped around Christine's waist, both of them smiling so widely, so comfortably. How many times had I smiled like that beside him? But there it was, his shared moment of happiness with someone else. This wasn't just a photo, it was a declaration. A truth I couldn't escape. I could feel the rage bubbling inside me, the same rage that would have once sent me storming over to Corin's office, demanding explanations, causing a scene for everyone to witness. But something in me had shifted. The usual fire wasn't there. It was replaced with something colder, something more resolute. I commented on the post, a simple phrase, a perfect match. And then I waited. The seconds felt like hours. The phone rang, and I recognized his voice instantly. "Hannah, are you out of your mind? What's wrong with you?" His voice was sharp, almost venomous. He was furious. I could hear his breath quickening, the sound of his hands pacing across a hard surface. "You can't even take a joke, can you?" He hung up before I could even respond. I wasn't surprised by his reaction. I had expected it, even. But it didn't hurt the way it once would have. I had spent years seeking his approval, yearning for his attention. But now I was different. Now, it didn't matter. As I set the phone down, I glanced at the office clock. There was still no sign of Corin coming home. He had promised me, after all, that he would return early to celebrate my birthday with me. But by midnight, I was still alone, waiting. If it weren't for that post, I would have stayed up all night, foolishly believing that he would eventually come through, that he'd show up and apologize for being late or forgetful. But he hadn't. The truth of the situation settled on me like a heavy stone. It was clear now, Corin had never been mine to hold. And as much as I had fought for him, as much as I had twisted myself into knots to fit into his world, it had never been enough. I wasn't his priority, and I never would be. The table I had prepared for him sat untouched, the food cold. I finally managed to shake off my thoughts, still not sure what to make of them, when I placed a sandwich on the table in front of Corin. He walked into the kitchen without a word, eyes scanning the room before they landed on the plate. "Where's mine?" His voice was flat, disinterested. I blinked, taken aback by his question. "Didn't you eat?" I asked, confused. I thought Christine must have prepared something. For him, but I kept my voice neutral. I didn't want to give anything away, not after what had happened earlier. Corin glanced at the sandwich on my plate and sneered. "This trash isn't worth eating anyway," he muttered under his breath, his words like a slap. I could feel my chest tighten, but instead of fighting back, instead of engaging, I simply nodded. "Yeah, you don't like it anyway." He stiffened, the words hitting him harder than he expected. But it didn't matter. I didn't care. Before I can it, Corin tossed a small paper bag onto the table. "I bought you a lipstick," he said nonchalantly, as if his gesture could erase the tension in the air. I didn't even look at the bag. "Thanks," I replied dismissively, the words feeling hollow in my mouth. He walked away, no doubt expecting me to jump up and apologize, to rush over and accept the gift like I always did. But not this time. Not anymore. Then I heard it, a soft ding from his phone. Glancing over, I saw the name that made my heart twist again, Chris. Corin, the message said, "Thank you for being with me yesterday. I feel much better now." Before I could even process the words, Corin, who had been in the bathroom, appeared in the doorway. He must have noticed me looking at his phone. Without warning, he yanked me backwards, slamming my back against the wall. The impact took my breath away. "Who the hell gave you permission to look at my phone?" he shouted, the fury in his eyes unlike anything I had ever seen. I winced, clutching my shoulder where it felt dislocated. The pain was sharp, but what stung more was the realization that Corin, my husband, was capable of hurting me physically and emotionally, and yet still expecting my forgiveness, my devotion. He must have seen the shock on my face because his expression softened, though not with concern. "It's just a light bump, no need to overreact," he said impatient. TLY, as if his actions didn't matter. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat, the bitterness rising so quickly that I feared it might choke me. Corin seemed to notice my silence. His eyes narrowed, and he muttered under his breath, "Fine. I'll drive you to work later." But I wasn't listening anymore. Not really. As I gathered my things, Corin's presence in the house felt suffocating. I knew I was done. Everything about this relationship, everything about him, felt like a lie. And the worst part was that I had allowed it to go on for so long, always excusing him, always making excuses for his actions. But not anymore. I was done. And somehow, I felt free. Part 2, The Silent Awakening. The drive to work the next morning was as uncomfortable as I'd expected. Corin's presence was a constant weight beside me, but now it felt different. Instead of the usual warmth, the space between us felt like an abyss, one that neither of us dared to cross. I noticed the little charm hanging from the rearview mirror, a soft, fluffy cat with bright eyes. It was something that Christine had insisted on hanging up after she'd visited, claiming it brought good luck. I stared at it for a moment, my fingers twitching as if I could just reach up and yank it off, but I didn't. I didn't care enough anymore. Corin, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes flickered briefly to the charm, his lips tightening as if irritated by its presence. "You're lucky I didn't keep that tacky charm up here," he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with distaste. It was too childish. I glanced at him, surprised. "If you don't like it, you can take it down yourself," I said calmly, trying to keep my tone neutral. It didn't matter. Nothing he said or did mattered anymore. Corin's eyebrows furrowed, and he shot me a look of confusion, perhaps expecting me to argue, to fight for the charm as I would have in the past. But not today. Not anymore. The drive was eerily quiet after that. We both just stared straight ahead, the sound of the engine humming and the road passing by like a blur. It was almost as if we were strangers. In the past, these drives would have been filled with small talk, banter, or perhaps an argument. But today? Today, there was nothing. When we reached the intersection, I realized we weren't heading toward my office building at all. I was about to say something when Corin spoke, his voice annoyed. "Can you stop nagging while I'm driving?" He snapped, his hands tightening around the wheel. I blinked, taken aback. I had asked him to take a different route to the office, but apparently he had forgotten. "This isn't the right way," I said slowly, pointing toward the other side of the street. My office is at the IO building. We're heading toward Starlight Tower. He clicked his tongue in annoyance. Why didn't you say something earlier? He grumbled, making a sharp turn to get back on track. I didn't. T reply. What was the point? In the past, I would have been upset, angry even, at the thought that he'd forgotten something so simple. But now, I simply didn't care. I wasn't angry. I wasn't anything. I was just numb. As the car veered off the road and headed back in the right direction, Corin's phone rang. The ringtone was familiar, Pikachu, the one Christine liked. I had heard it enough times to recognize it instantly. Corin picked up, his voice dropping to a soft tone. Chris? What's wrong? He listened intently for a moment before pulling over to the side of the road. Listen, he said to me, his voice suddenly cold and distant, I need to drop you off here. Christine's cat is sick, and I need to take her to the vet. You can find your own way to work today. I froze, my fingers tightening around my bag. I looked at him, feeling the same icy calmness wash over me. The words that had once triggered an explosion of fury no longer had that effect. I didn't feel the rage. I didn't feel the hurt. All I felt was an overwhelming sense of detachment. Fine, I said, my voice steady and unbothered. I'll find my own way. He didn't look at me, not even as I got out of the car. I stood there on the side of the road as he sped away without a second thought. I could have gotten a cab, but the morning rush made it nearly impossible to hail one, and I ended up standing in the cold for over an hour, waiting for a ride that never came. By the time I made it to the office, I was already late. I couldn't find the energy to care. I didn't even care that my shoulder was still aching from the previous night's incident. That evening, Corin returned home as if nothing had happened. He walked into the kitchen, looking around, his face as blank as ever. Where's the late-night snack? He asked, his voice demanding, but not really expecting an answer. I turned from the stove, my hand still gripping the spatula. I didn't feel like making it tonight, I said softly, not bothering to look at him. Didn't check my phone. There was a pause, a moment where the tension between us grew thick enough that I could almost feel it. Then, he handed me a small box, pushing it toward me like it was some sort of peace offering. Here, he said gruffly. You mentioned wanting to buy a necklace last time. I got this for you. I didn't open it. Instead, I stared at the box for a moment, remembering the last time he'd given me a gift like this, the last time he'd tried to buy my forgiveness. I wasn't in the mood for his gestures anymore. His apologies were hollow, meaningless. Thanks, I muttered, though the words felt empty. His face faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered, attempting to mask his disappointment. Try it on, he urged, stepping closer to me, his voice more insistent now. Come on, just try it on. I hesitated. The necklace he was offering felt like just another token, another attempt to manipulate me into forgiving him. I could see it in his eyes, he expected me to fall for it, to smile, to thank him like I always had. But this time, I didn't. The weight of his touch as he reached for me felt wrong, like something that didn't belong. My hands instinctively blocked his, and in my rush, the necklace snapped in two. Corin's expression hardened, and he sneered. Are you still angry about this morning? He asked, his voice dripping with frustration. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned away from him and began gathering my things, my mind made up. Fine, he grumbled, his words filled with bitterness. Go ahead and run away. Again. I didn't dignify his words with an answer. I simply walked toward the door, my movement steady, calm. I wasn't running away anymore. I was walking away, leaving him behind. I'm going to work overtime, I said flatly, the words hanging in the air like a final sentence. Corin stared after me for a long moment. His eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, anger, perhaps. Or maybe desperation. But it didn't matter. I was done. Part 3, A Cold Game. I didn't feel the need to explain myself anymore. The days of chasing Corin's approval were long gone, and with each passing moment, it became clearer that I didn't owe him an explanation for my actions. What was the point? He had made his choices, and now, so would I. The next few days went by in a haze of cold indifference. Corin didn't come home for dinner, didn't ask if I needed anything. He kept his distance, as if expecting me to come crawling back to him. But I didn't. I wasn't going to beg for his attention, not this time. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I returned home to find Corin sitting in the living room, staring at the television without truly watching it. His presence in the house no longer felt comforting. It felt like an obligation, something I could no longer ignore. He didn't greet me when I walked in. He didn't ask how my day was. Instead, he looked up briefly, his gaze cold, before returning to the screen. I set my bag down on the counter, deciding not to engage. There was no point in trying to salvage what was already broken. But then, as if to break the silence, Corin finally spoke. Where's the late-night snack? His voice was devoid of warmth, as if he were making a routine request. But this time, his words stung. The casual way he spoke, as if I were still the same woman who had catered to his every whim, made me sick. I didn't feel like making one, I replied, trying to keep my voice level. Didn't check my phone. For a long moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that grew heavy, suffocating. I could see the frustration building on Corin's face. He was used to me reacting, used to me trying to please him, even when he didn't deserve it. But not this time. Corin stood up, his movements stiff. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. Here, he said, holding it out to me with a forced smile. I got you something. You mentioned wanting to buy a necklace last time. I glanced at the box but didn't reach for it. The gesture felt so empty now, so calculated. The last time he'd given me a gift like this, it had been to smooth things over after a fight. But I wasn't interested in playing that game anymore. Thanks, I said, my tone flat, my eyes not even meeting his. But I've lost interest in wearing necklaces lately. I could see the surprise flicker in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by annoyance. He shoved the box toward me again, as if trying to force me to accept it. Try it on anyway, he urged, stepping closer to me. I hesitated, then reached up to take the box. But before I could open it, I heard a soft ding from his phone. My eyes flicked to the screen as it lit up with a message. Corin didn't notice it at first, but I did. It was from Christine. The message read, "Thank you for being with me yesterday. I feel much better now." Before I could even think, Corin looked down at the phone, noticing my gaze. Without thinking, he yanked the phone from the table and slammed it into my hands, his face contorting with fury. "What are you looking at?" He spat, his voice a growl. "Who gave you permission to look at my phone?" I froze, the sting of his words sinking in. The past would have had me pleading, apologizing, letting him make me feel small. But now, I just stared at him. The rage I expected to feel didn't come. It was replaced by something far colder. I could feel the weight of my shoulder, the injury from the night before, flaring up as I instinctively pulled away. My body ached, but not nearly as much as my heart did. Corin's face softened for a split second as he noticed my pain, but the softness was gone just as quickly. "It's nothin'. Gee," he muttered, turning his back to me. "Don't make a big deal out of it." I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Was this really the man I had loved? The man who had once been my world? Or had he been nothing more than a facade all along? I shook my head, the clarity hitting me like a flood. He wasn't worth it. None of it was worth it anymore. The next morning, the routine continued. Corin picked me up from the office, as he always did, but there was no warmth in the way he greeted me. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the tension between us. It was as if we were just going through the motions. As we drove, I noticed the familiar tension in the air. It wasn't the calm that had settled over us, it was the silence of two people who were pretending not to notice the distance between them. I didn't care. Halfway through the drive, Corin made an abrupt turn, and I realized we weren't headed toward the office anymore. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice neutral. "I'm taking you somewhere," he said shortly, his eyes focused on the road ahead. I didn't argue. Where he took me no longer mattered. All that mattered was that I was done. The thought of leaving, of breaking free from this toxic relationship, was no longer just a dream. It was a reality that was finally within my reach. Corin pulled up to a familiar spot, a small cafe we had visited countless times before. The place where we had shared our first date, where we had exchanged our first kiss. I looked out the window, feeling a sense of detachment wash over me. The memories of the happy times we once had here seemed so distant now, so faded. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I looked at him, the emptiness in my chest growing. "What's there to talk about?" I replied, my voice steady, but my heart was sinking. His eyes widened slightly, the realization that I wasn't going to forgive him so easily settling over him. "Hannah. Please, I'm trying. I know I messed up. I need you to understand." I shook my head, a sad smile playing on my lips. "I don't need to understand, Corin. I've been trying to for so long, and it's never enough. It's never been enough." He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "I don't want this anymore," I said firmly. "Not with you. Not with the lies. Not with the games. I'm done." There was silence between us, thick and suffocating. I could see the shock on his face, the disbelief that I wasn't going to fall for his act again. But there was something else there too, fear. Corin had always been in control, always had the power in our relationship. But now, he was losing it. And I was finally okay with that. I opened the door and stepped out of the car, walking away without looking back. I didn't care if he called after me. I didn't care if he begged me to stay. I was free. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Part 4, The Final Choice. The days that followed were the most liberating I had ever experienced. With each step I took away from Corin, away from the suffocating control he once held over me, I felt lighter, freer. I no longer worried about pleasing him or keeping up appearances. I was finally living for myself, something I hadn't done in years. I spent my days at work, throwing myself into my projects with an energy that had been missing for far too long. The office felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could focus, create, and prove to myself that I was more than just Corin's wife. I was my own person, and I would be damned if I let anyone make me feel less than that again. But Corin, of course, wasn't ready to let go. He didn't understand. He couldn't. For years, I had been everything to him, the woman who adored him, who put up with his nonsense, who accepted his flaws as if they were part of who he was. And now that I was no longer willing to play the part, he was scrambling to hold on. He tried everything. Texts, calls, gifts, none of them worked. The man who once knew exactly how to manipulate me into submission was now losing his grip, and it frustrated him more than I could have imagined. One evening, as I was heading home from work, I noticed a familiar figure standing in front of my apartment building. Corin. His presence was like a dark cloud hanging over me, and for a moment, I debated whether I should simply turn around and go back the way I came. But I didn't. I walked toward him, my steps firm, my resolve unshakable. "Hannah," Corin called out as I approached, his voice strained. "Can we talk? Please?" I stopped in front of him, my eyes cold, my heart steady. "What's left to say, Corin?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "You had your chance, and you blew it." His eyes searched mine, desperation creeping into his voice. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But please, don't do this. I can change. I've already made things right with Christine. I'm not that person anymore." I didn't flinch. I didn't even feel the pang of hurt that I would have felt before. Instead, I stared at him, my gaze unwavering. "You're right about one thing," I said quietly. "You've changed. You're not the person I thought you were. And that's exactly why I can't stay." He opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off, my voice growing colder. "You think a few changes, a few apologies, are enough to fix years of manipulation, lies, and selfishness? It's not, Corin. It's never going to be enough." His face twisted in frustration, and he reached out as if to grab my arm, but I stepped back, avoiding his touch. "Hannah, please. Don't leave me like this. We can fix this. I need you." I stared at him for a moment, taking in his disheveled appearance, the way his clothes hung loosely on him, the dark circles under his eyes. He looked pathetic, a far cry from the man I had once admired. And in that moment, I realized something. Corin wasn't the man I had fallen in love with. The man I had loved had long since disappeared, replaced by someone who didn't care about me, someone who only cared about keeping me in his control. I had let him, and I had suffered for it. But not anymore. "I don't need you," I said quietly, the words landing like a weight between us. "I never need you. And I don't want you in my life anymore." Corin's expression crumpled, the anger giving way to something else, regret, maybe, or maybe fear. But it didn't matter. His feelings no longer mattered to me. I had spent too many years worrying about his emotions, his desires, his needs. But now I was focusing on myself. I turned and walked into the building, leaving him standing there, frozen in the hallway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next few days were oddly peaceful. I had finally come to terms with the fact that I didn't need Corin. I was stronger than I had ever been. I found joy in the small things again, in my work, in my friends, in my own company. The weight that had been on my shoulders for so long was gone. But the peace I had found wouldn't last. One afternoon, while I was enjoying a rare moment of quiet at home, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but something told me I should pick it up. Han. Ah, a voice said on the other end. It's Marco. You need to know something. I felt my heart skip a beat. Marco was one of Corin's closest friends, and despite the way he had always acted like everything was fine, I knew he had never really liked me. He had always been an enabler for Corin's behavior. What is it, Marco? I asked, my voice cautious. Corin, he's not doing well. He's been really messed up since he left. He's been saying things, doing things. I'm worried about him. I felt a pang of something, but I couldn't tell if it was sympathy or something else. What are you saying, Marco? Is he hurt? He's been talking about hurting himself, Marco said quietly. I think you need to come see him. Maybe you're the only one who can talk some sense into him. I felt my stomach twist. The old part of me, the part that had once cared for him deeply, wanted to rush to his side to fix things. But the new part of me, the part that had learned to let go, better. I'm not his savior, I said, my voice steady. You need to deal with him, Marco. I've done enough. I hung up without waiting for a response. And yet, as I set the phone down, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. I had no sympathy left for Corin. But somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't over. It wasn't as simple as walking away. But it would be, soon. I had made my choice. Part 5, the final act. The days that followed Marco's call were a blur, my mind consumed by a strange mix of relief and discomfort. I had made my decision, or so I thought. I wasn't going to let Corin's drama pull me back in. But something about his desperation, his continued attempts to manipulate me into returning, gnawed at me. I went on with my life. I focused on my career, made plans for my future, and spent time with friends who supported me. Betty and Maxwell were my pillars during this time. They understood my decision to leave Corin, but I could tell they were worried about the toll it might take on me. I could see it in their eyes, the concern, the protectiveness. They knew how much I had invested in Corin, how much I had sacrificed. But the truth was, the weight of the past was lifting from my shoulders each day. I was finally feeling like myself again. I didn't need Corin's validation, his gifts, his constant attempts to control my life. For the first time, I felt free. Yet, Corin was still out there, and his obsession with me was growing. One night, while I was out at a cafe with Betty, I got another call from an unknown number. Hannah, Corin's voice came through, desperate, as always. Please, just let me explain. I can't live like this anymore. I know I messed up. But if you just give me a chance, we can fix everything. I'll change. Please, don't leave me like this. I didn't know whether to feel sorry for him or angry. I had heard these words a dozen times before, each time with the same empty promises. I've heard enough, Corin, I said, my voice cold and final. You don't get to play the victim anymore. I'm done. Don't call me again. I hung up without waiting for a response. The relief that washed over me in that moment was like nothing I had ever experienced. The years of uncertainty, of wondering if I had made the right choice, were gone. I had taken control of my life, and no one, not Corin, not anyone, could take that from me. The next few days were peaceful. For once, I wasn't walking on eggshells, worrying about Corin's mood, his anger, his guilt trips. But that peace was short-lived. One morning, I opened my front door to find a package on the doorstep. It was addressed to me in Corin's handwriting. My heart sank as I picked it up. I knew it was from him, but I had no idea what he could possibly want now. I opened it carefully. Inside, there was a small velvet box. I recognized the shape. It was an necklace, exactly like the one he had tried to give me a few weeks ago. But this one was different. There was a note inside, written in his familiar scrawl. "I'm sorry for everything, Hannah. I know I hurt you. I can't undo the past, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Please, forgive me." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The necklace was beautiful, but it was just another attempt to buy my forgiveness, to pull me back into his world. His words were hollow, empty. It wasn't the first time he had apologized, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, I wasn't fooled. I set the box aside, picking up my phone to call Betty. I didn't want to deal with this on my own. "Betty, you're right," I said after she picked up. "I need to let go for good." "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm okay," I replied. "Stronger than I've ever been, actually. But Corin, he's still trying. He sent me another necklace, another apology. It's the same game, Betty. The same manipulation. But I won't fall for it anymore." She was silent for a moment, and I could hear the relief in her voice when she spoke again. "You've made the right choice, Hanny. You know that, right? This is the only way forward. He'll never change. You don't need him to be happy." Her words sank deep into my heart. I had spent so long trying to make Corin happy, trying to fix what was broken, that I had forgotten what it was like to focus on my own happiness. But now, I was free. I didn't need him to define my worth. That evening, as I sat on my couch, reflecting on the journey I had come through, I finally felt at peace. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was content. The doorbell rang suddenly, jolting me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood up, cautious, as I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Corin, standing there, his face pale and drawn. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of everything I had learned. I wasn't going to let him back into my life. Not now. Not ever again. I opened the door, meeting his gaze without flinching. "What do you want, Corin?" He swallowed, looking at me with desperation in his eyes. "Hannah, please. I'm begging you. Just listen to me for once." I shook my head, the firm S in my voice unwavering. "No, Corin. There's nothing left to say. I'm done. We're done. Please leave." His face crumpled, his eyes wild with something between rage and heartbreak. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't lose you." I stepped back, closing the door slowly, my eyes still locked on him through the small crack. "You already did," I said quietly. "And it's your fault." With that, I closed the door, sealing that chapter of my life behind me for good. I didn't look back. 2 months later, I was sitting at my desk at work, feeling a sense of accomplishment as I reviewed the latest project I had been leading. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Betty. Just saw Corin's post on social media. He's a wreck, Hanny. But you're doing great. I'm so proud of you. I smiled, the weight of her words lifting my spirits. I had let go. I had found my strength, my freedom. And I would never let anyone take that from me again. The next day, I received a call from the UK office. My promotion had come through, and I was being considered for a managerial role. Everything was falling into place, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly living. I had left the past behind, and the future was finally mine to shape. The months went by, and my life in the UK flourished. I had grown, both personally and professionally. I learned to rely on myself, to trust in my own strength. Then one evening, as I was walking home from work, I heard a voice calling out behind me. I turned, expecting it to be a colleague or someone I knew. But when I saw him, standing there in the rain, I froze. It was Corin. His clothes were soaked, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a ghost, standing there in the cold, shivering. Hannah, he said softly, his voice trembling. I've changed. I was wrong about everything. Please. I need you. I looked at him for a long moment, my heart aching. But I knew, deep down, that nothing had changed. Not really. I'm sorry, Corin, I said gently, my voice steady. But you're too late. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving him behind, forever.